I'm back. Um, so yesterday when I read, they got their Christmas presents, and their Christmas looks a lot different than Christmases today. Um, can't like what is it? Licorice, store-bought licorice, oranges and bananas in their stocking. Certainly simple, and the kids were so psyched. It goes to show the things that were important too, family and food, comfort. After the church services, the Averys returned home with us for Christmas dinner. All 8 of the Avery children, including the 4 preschoolers, crowded into the kitchen with the boys and me, smelling the delicious aromas and awaiting a call to eat. But only the eldest girls, who were helping Mama, Big Ma, and Mrs. Avery prepare the finishing touches to the meal, were allowed to remain. The rest of us were continuously being shooed out by Big Ma. Finally, the announcement we were all waiting for was made, and we were allowed to begin the Christmas feast. The meal lasted for over 2 hours through firsts, seconds, and thirds, talk and laughter, and finally dessert. When we were finished, the boys and I, with Claude and TJ, went outside, but the half-inch layer of snow made everything sloppy. So we soon went back in and joined the adults by the fire. Shortly afterward, there was a timid knock on the front door. Stacy opened the door and found Jeremy Sims standing there looking frozen and very frightened as he peered into the bright room. Everyone turned to stare at him. Stacy glanced around at Papa, then back at Jeremy. You want to come in? He asked awkwardly. Jeremy nodded and stepped hesitantly inside. As Stacy motioned him toward the fire, Uncle Hammer's eyes narrowed and he said to Papa, "He looks like a Sims." "I believe he is," agreed Papa. "Then what the devil? Let me handle it," Papa said. Jeremy, who had heard, flushed a deep red and quickly handed Mama a small burlap bag. "Brung them for y'all." Mama took the bag. As she opened it, I peered over her shoulder. The bag was full of peanuts. "Peanuts?" I questioned. "Peanuts? Why, we got more peanuts than we know what to do with." "Cassie," Mama scowled, "what have I told you about that mouth of yours?" Then she turned to Jeremy. "This is very thoughtful of you, Jeremy, and we appreciate them. Thank you." Jeremy nodded slightly as if he didn't know how to accept her thanks, and stiffly handed a slender paper-wrapped object to Stacy. "I made it for you," he said. Stacy looked at Papa to see if he should take it. For a long moment, Papa studied Jeremy. Then he nodded. It ain't much," stammered Jeremy, as Stacy tore off the wrapping. "Made it myself." Stacy slid his fingers down the smooth, sanded back of a wooden flute. "Go ahead and try it," said a pleased Jeremy. "It blows real nice." Again, Stacy looked at Papa, but this time Papa gave him no indication what he should do. "Thanks, Jeremy. It's real nice," he said finally. Then, flute in hand, he stood uncomfortably by the door, waiting for Jeremy to leave. When Jeremy didn't move, Papa asked, "You Charlie Sims's boy?" Jeremy nodded. "Yes, sir." "Your daddy know you're here?" Jeremy bit his lower lip and looked at his feet. "No, sir. I reckon not." "Then I expect you better be getting on home, son, 'fore he comes looking for you." "Yes, sir," said Jeremy, backing away. As he reached the door, I cried after him, "Merry Christmas, Jeremy." Jeremy looked back and smiled shyly. "Merry Christmas to y'all, too." TJ made no comment on Jeremy's visit until both Papa and Uncle Hammer had left the room. He was afraid of Papa and downright terrified of Uncle Hammer, so he never had much to say when either was around. But now that they had gone outside with Mr. Avery, he said, "You ain't gonna keep that thing, are you?" Stacy looked malevolently at TJ, and I knew he was thinking of the coat. "Yeah, I'm gonna keep it. Why?" TJ shrugged. "Nothing, except I sure wouldn't want no whistle some old white boy been blowing on." I watched Stacy closely to see if he was going to allow himself to be goaded by TJ. He was not. "Oh, stuff it, TJ," he ordered. "Oh, man, don't get me wrong," said TJ quickly. "You want to keep that old thing, it's up to you. But for me, somebody give me something, I want it to be something fine. Like that What does he want it to be fine like? Here's some more foreshadowing, like that pretty little pearl-handled pistol. When the Averys had left, Stacy asked, Papa, how come Jeremy gave me this flute? I mean, I didn't give him nothing. Maybe you did give him something, said Papa, lighting his pipe. No, sir, Papa, I ain't never give him nothing. Not even your friendship? Well, not really. I mean, he a crazy kid. He likes to walk to school with us, but do you like him? Stacy frowned, thinking, I told him I didn't want him walking with us, but he keeps on anyway, and the white kids laugh at him because he do. But he don't seem to let it bother him none. I suppose I like him all right. Is that wrong? No, Papa said carefully, it ain't wrong. Actually, he's much easier to get along with than TJ, Stacy went on, and I suppose if I let him, he could be a better friend than TJ. Papa took the pipe from his mouth, rubbed his mustache, and spoke quietly. As far as I'm concerned, friendship between black and white don't mean that much, 'cause it usually ain't on equal basis. Right now, you and Jeremy might get along fine, but in a few years, he'll think of himself as a man, but you'll probably still be a boy to him, and if he feels that way, he'll turn on you in a minute. But Papa, I don't think Jeremy'd be like that. Papa's eyes narrowed. We Logans don't have much to do with white folks. Know why? Because white folks mean trouble. You see blacks hanging around with whites, they're headed for trouble. Maybe one day whites and blacks can be real friends. But right now, the country ain't built that way. Remember, this is 1933. So things were a lot different. It was before segregation ended, before the civil rights movement. Life is much, much different now. But this was the way that it was thought of back then because of segregation. Now you could be right about Jeremy making a much finer friend than TJ ever will be. Trouble is, down here in Mississippi, it costs too much to find out, so I think you better not try. Stacy looked full into Papa's face and read his meaning. On my way to bed, I stopped by the boys' room to retrieve an orange Christopher John had swiped from my stocking. Christopher John, the pudgy one always eating. And spied Stacy fingering the flute. As I stood in the doorway, he lingered over it, then carefully rewrapped it, placed it in his box of treasured things. I never saw the flute again. The day after, Papa summoned Stacy, Christopher John, Little Man, and me into the barn. We'd hoped against hope that Mama wouldn't tell him about our trip to the Wallace store, or that if she had, he'd forget what he promised. We should have known better. Mama always told Papa everything, and Papa never forgot anything. After we'd received our punishment, we emerged sore and teary-eyed and watched Papa, Uncle Hammer, and Mr. Morrison climb into the Packard and speed away. Mama said they were going to Vicksburg. Why Vicksburg, Mama? I asked. They got some business to attend to, she said shortly. Come on now, get busy. We've got chores to do. In the late afternoon, shortly after the men had returned, Mr. Jamison arrived. He brought with him a fruit cake sent by Mrs. Jamison and a bag of lemon drops for each of the boys and me. Mama allowed us to say our thanks and then sent us outside. We played for a while in the patches of snow that remained. But when that grew tiresome, I popped into the house to see what was happening. Mama ordered me to pop back out again. What's they doing? Asked Little Man. Looking at a whole bunch of papers. Uncle Hammer was signing something. What kind of papers? Asked Stacy. I don't know, but Mr. Jamison said something about selling the land. Selling the land? Questioned Stacy. You sure? I nodded. He said if y'all sign them papers and Miss Caroline has no more legal right to this land. Can't sell it, can't sign on it. It'll be y'all in y'all's name. It'll take both of y'all to do anything about it. So Big Ma is putting the land in Hammer and David's name so that it's all legal and done. Both of who? I shrugged again. Papa and Uncle Hammer, I guess. After a while, it grew chilly and we went inside. Mr. Jamison, sitting next to Big Ma, was putting some papers in his briefcase. I hope you feel better now that that's done, Miss Caroline, he said, his voice a soft mixture of Southern aristocracy and Northern schooling. Hammer and David, they've been taking care of this things here for a long time now, Big Ma said. Them and Mary works hard to pay the taxes and mortgage on this here place, and I've been wanting to make sure it's theirs while I'm still breathing. I ain't wanting a whole lot of problems after I'm gone about who's got rights to this land. She paused a moment, then added, that happens sometimes, you know. Mr. Jamison nodded. He was a long, thin man in his mid-50s with a perfect lawyer face, so placid that it was difficult to guess what thoughts lay behind it. The boys and I sat down silently at the study table, and the silence allowed us to stay. I figured Mr. Jamison would be leaving now. His business was evidently finished, and despite the fact that the family thought well of him, he wasn't considered a friend in the usual sense, and there seemed no reason for him to stay longer. But now Mr. Jamison put his briefcase back on the floor, indicating that he wasn't leaving. He looked first at Big Ma and then Mama, then across at Papa and Uncle Hammer. There's talk that some people around here are looking to shop in Vicksburg, he said. Big Ma looked around at Papa and Uncle Hammer, but neither of them acknowledged her glance. Their eyes were pinned on Mr. Jamison. There's talk, too, why folks are looking to shop there. He paused, met Papa's eyes, and then Uncle Hammer's, and went on. As you know, my family has roots in Vicksburg. We have a number of friends there still. I got a call from one of them this morning, said you were looking to find credit for about 30 families. Papa and Uncle Hammer neither affirmed nor denied this. You know as well as I do, credit doesn't come easy these days, continued Mr. Jamison. You expect to get any, you're going to need something to back it. I reckon we know that, said Mr. Hammer. Mr. Jamison glanced at Uncle Hammer and nodded. I reckon you did. But as far as I can see, the only thing you've got to put up for credit is this land, and I'd hate to see you put it up. Why is that? Asked Uncle Hammer, wary of his interest. Because you'd lose it. The fire popped and the room grew silent. Then Papa said, what are you getting at? I'll back the credit. Again, silence. Mr. Jamison allowed Papa and Uncle Hammer several moments to search for a motive behind his mask-like face. I'm a Southerner, born and bred, but that doesn't mean I approve of the things that go on here, and there are a lot of other white people who feel the same. If you and so many others feel that way, said Uncle Hammer with a sneer, then how come them Wallaces aren't in jail? Hammer, Big Ma stated. Because, answered Mr. Jamison, there aren't enough of those same white people who would admit how they feel, or even if they did, would hang a white man for killing a black one. It's as simple as that. Uncle Hammer smiled slightly and shook his head, but his eyes showed a grudging respect for Mr. Jamison. Backing the loan will be strictly a business matter. In the fall, when the crops come in, these people who have bought goods in Vicksburg will have to pay for them. If they don't, I'll have to. Of course, being a businessman, I'm not hoping I'll have to put out a penny. My own cash box isn't exactly overflowing, so there'll have to be a credit limit. Still, it would lend me a great deal of satisfaction to know I was a part of all this. He looked around. What do you think? You know, said Papa, it ain't hardly likely that after accounts have figured there going to be any money to pay these debts at all, except maybe at the Wallace store. Mr. Jamison nodded knowingly. I know, but the offer still stands. Papa inhaled deeply. Well, then I'd say it's up to you and these people who'll be buying on your signature. If they want to do it, and I got no say about it. We always pay cash. You know, if you sign that credit, said Uncle Hammer, you won't be the most popular man down here. You thought about that? Yes, said Mr. Jamison thoughtfully. My wife and I discussed it fully. We realized what could happen, but I'm just wondering if you do. Besides the fact that a number of white folks around here resent this land you've got and your independent attitude, there's Harlan Granger. Now, I've known Harlan all my life, and he's not going to like this. I wanted to ask what Mr. Granger had to do with anything, but common sense told me that I would only earn eviction by asking. But then Mr. Jamison went on and explained without any prodding from me. Ever since we were boys, Harlan's lived in the past. His grandmother filled him with all kinds of tales about the glory of the South before the war. You know, back then the Grangers had one of the biggest plantations in the state, and Spokane County practically belonged to them. And they thought it did too. They were consulted about everything concerning this area, and they felt it was up to them to see that things worked smoothly according to the law. A law, basically, for whites. Well, Harlan feels the same now as his grandmother did back then. He also feels strongly about this land, and he resents the fact that you won't sell it back to him. You back the credit with it now, and he'll seize the opportunity to take it away from you. You can count on it. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had grown so quiet, I had to lean forward to hear his next words. And if you continue to encourage people not to shop at the Wallace store, you could still lose it. Don't forget that Harlan leases that store land to the Wallaces and gets a hefty percentage of its revenue. Before he let the Wallaces set up shopkeeping, he was only getting his sharecropper money. Now he gets a nice bit of Montier and Harrison's sharecropper money too, since both of those plantations are too small to have a store. And he's not hardly going to stand for your interfering with it. But even more important than that, you're pointing a finger right at the Wallaces with this boycott business. You're not only accusing them of murder, which in this case would only be a minor consideration because the man killed was black, but you're saying they should be punished for it. That they should be punished as if they killed a white man. And punishment of a white man for a wrong done to a black man would denote equality. Now that is what Harlan Granger absolutely will not permit. Mr. Jamison was silent, waiting. No one else spoke, and he went on again. What John Henry Berry and his brother was accused of, making advances to a white woman, goes against the grain of Harlan Granger and most other white folks in this community more than anything else. You know that. Harlan may not believe in the methods of the Wallaces, but he'll definitely support them. Believe me on that. Mr. Jamison picked up his briefcase, ran his fingers through his graying hair, and met Papa's eyes. Sad thing, you know. In the end, you can't beat them or the Wallaces. Papa looked down at the boys and me, awaiting his reply, then nodded slightly as if he agreed. Still, he said, I want these children to know we tried. And what we can't do now, maybe one day they will. I do hope so, David, murmured Mr. Jamison, going to the door. I truly hope so. And without all that bravery, bravery of whites, bravery of black people at the time, changes would not have been made. Stands had to be taken, and risks had to be taken at the risk of, being killed. In the days that followed Mr. Jamison's visit, Papa, Mama, and Uncle Hammer went to the houses of those folks who were considering shopping in Vicksburg. On the fourth day, Papa and Uncle Hammer went to the houses of those families who were considering shopping in Vicksburg. On the fourth day, Papa and Uncle Hammer again went to Vicksburg, but this time in the wagon with Mr. Morrison. Their journey took 2 days, and when they returned, the wagon was loaded down with store-bought goods. What's all that? Asked Papa. That for us? No, Cassie girls, things folks ordered from Vicksburg. I wanted to ask more questions about the trip, but Papa seemed in a hurry to be off again, and my questions went unanswered until the following day when Mr. Granger arrived. Christopher John and I were drawing water from the well when the silver Packard glided to a smooth stop in the drive, and Mr. Granger stepped out. He stared with a sour face at Uncle Hammer's Packard in the barn, then opened the gate to the front yard and stepped briskly across the lawn to the house. Hastily, Christopher John and I tugged on the well rope, pulled up the water tube, and poured the water into the bucket. Each of us gripping the side of the heavy bucket, we hurried to the back porch where we deposited it, then tiptoed slightly through the empty kitchen to the door leading to Mama and Papa's room. Little man and Stacy, just leaving the room under Mama's orders, allowed the door to remain slightly cracked, and all 4 of us huddled against it stepladder fashion. You sure giving folks something to talk about with that car of yours, Hammer, Mr. Granger said in his folksy dialect as he sat down with a grunt across from Papa. In spite of his college education, he always spoke this way. What they got you doing up north? Bootlegging whiskey? That means selling. Back then, it was illegal to drink alcohol, so bootlegging was basically illegal sales of alcohol. Liquor. He laughed dryly, indicating that the question was to be taken lightly, but his eyes, tight on Uncle Hammer, showed that he intended to have an answer. Uncle Hammer, leaning against the fireplace mantel, did not laugh. Don't need to bootleg, he said sullenly. Up there, I got me a man's job, and they pay me a man's wages. Mr. Granger studied Uncle Hammer. Uncle Hammer wore, as he had every day since he arrived, sharply creased pants, a vest over a snow-white shirt, and shoes that shone like midnight. You right citified, ain't you? Of course, you always did think you was too good to work in the fields like other folks. Nah, that ain't it, said Uncle Hammer. I just ain't never figured 50 cents a day was worth a child's time, let alone a man's wages. Uncle Hammer said nothing else. He didn't need to. Everyone knew that 50 cents was the top price paid to any day laborer, man, woman, or child hired to work in the Granger fields. Mr. Granger ran his tongue around his teeth, making his lips protrude in odd half circles. Then he turned from Uncle Hammer to Papa. Some folks tell me y'all running a regular traveling store up here. Here, tell a fella can get just about anything he wants from up at Tate's in Vicksburg if he just lets y'all know. Papa met Mr. Granger's eyes, but didn't speak. Mr. Granger shook his head. Seems to me you folks are just stirring up something. Y'all got roots in this community. Even got yourselves that loan Paul Edward made at the First National Bank up in Strawberry for that eastern 200 acres. Course, now with times like they are, that mortgage could come due any time. And if it comes due and y'all ain't got the money to pay it, y'all could lose this place. Because when someone takes out a mortgage, there are basically a payment plan is set up, because you can't, you're not going to be able to purchase the home without a bank saying that they will loan you the money, and then the bank gives that money to whoever you're purchasing from, and you make payments to the bank. So he's basically saying, times as they are, which this could not happen. If I took out a loan, there are laws that prevent this from ever happening. If you take out a loan and you're making your payments on time and you're doing everything in the contract the way that you said on the due dates with the amount of money and the interest and so on, and you're keeping up on your payments, they can't just say, okay, the whole thing's due, you have to pay it or get out. That's not legal. But back then they could do that in a small town, that was mostly run by whites. So he's basically saying, your mortgage could come due anytime. Ain't gonna lose this land, said Uncle Hammer flatly. Mr. Granger glanced up at Uncle Hammer, then back to Papa. He took a cigar from his pocket, then a knife to cut off the tip. After he'd thrown the tip into the fire, he settled back in his chair, lit the cigar while Papa, Mama, Uncle Hammer, and Big Ma waited for him to get on. Then he said, a fine community, got fine folks in it, both white and colored. Whatever's bothering you people, y'all just tell me. We'll get it straightened out without all this big to-do. Uncle Hammer laughed outright. Mr. Granger looked up sharply, but Uncle Hammer eyed him insolently, and a smile still on his lips. Mr. Granger, watching him, cautioned sternly, I don't like trouble here. This is a quiet and peaceful place, and I aim to see it stays that way. Turning back to Papa, he continued, whatever problems we have, we can work them out. I ain't gonna hide, I think y'all's making a big mistake, both for the community and for yourselves, going all the way down to Vicksburg to do your shopping. That don't seem very neighborly. Neither does burning, said Uncle Hammer. Mr. Granger puffed deeply on his cigar and didn't look at Uncle Hammer. When he spoke again, it was to Big Ma. His voice was harsh, but he made no comment on what Uncle Hammer had said. I don't think your Paul Edward would have condoned such a thing like this and risk losing this land. How come you letting your boys do it? Big Ma smoothed the lap of her dress with her hands. They're grown, and it's their land. I've got no more say in it. Mr. Granger's eyes showed no surprise, but he pursed his lips again and ran his tongue around his teeth. Price of cotton's mighty low, y'all know that, he said finally. Could be I'll just have to charge my people more for their crops next summer just to make ends meet. I'd hate to do it, because if I did, my people wouldn't hardly have enough to buy winter stores, let alone be able to pay their debts. There was a tense wait in silence before his glance slid to Papa. He's talking about the families that work on his plantation. Mr. Joe Higgins up at First National told me he couldn't hardly honor a loan to folks who go around stirring up a lot of bad feelings in the community. And especially stirring up colored folks out of their place, huh? Interjected Uncle Hammer. Mr. Granger paled, but didn't turn to Uncle Hammer. Money's too scarce, he continued, as if he hadn't heard. And folks like that are a poor risk. You ready to lose your land, David, because of this thing? Papa was lighting his pipe. He didn't look up until the flame had caught in the tobacco and held there. Then he turned to Mr. Granger. 200 acres of this place been Logan land for almost 50 years now. The other 200 for 15. We've been through bad times and good times. We ain't never lost none of it. Ain't gonna start now. Mr. Granger said quietly, "It was Granger land before it was Logan. Slave land," said Papa. Mr. Granger nodded. "Wouldn't have lost this section if it hadn't been stolen by your Yankee carpetbaggers after the war. But y'all keep on playing Santa Claus and I'm gonna get it back real easy. I want you to know that I plan to do whatever I need to keep peace down in here." Papa took the pipe from his mouth and stared into the fire. When he faced Mr. Granger again, his voice was very quiet, very distinct, very sure. "You being white, you can just about plan on anything you want, but I'm going to tell you this one thing. You plan on getting this land, you're planning on the wrong thing." Mama's hand crossed almost unseen to Papa's arm. Mr. Granger looked up slyly. "There's a lot of ways of stopping you, David." Papa impaled Mr. Granger with an icy stare. "Then you better make 'em good." Mr. Granger stood up, a smile creeping smugly over his lips as if he knew a secret but refused to tell. He glanced at Uncle Hammer, then turned and left, leaving silence behind him. More foreshadowing. A secret.